to not pay too much, and that you can also make use of things like the billboard effect. So this is kind of the process. So it first goes into demand forecasting, and then you optimize the bookings. So you choose which customer has the most, or you feel is going to bring the most to your company. Then you put controls in place to ensure that your optimization is put in place. Then you evaluate, and then you provide feedback to see if you can change the way you forecast and things like that. Certain things that are required in revenue management is that you have a fixed capacity. So, of course, in the short run, especially in a hotel, if you have 150 bookings and you only have 100 rooms, you cannot just produce 50 rooms from one day to the next, right? You have a perishable inventory, as we've already established just before. The demand fluctuates, so obviously, with seasonalities and things like that, demand is not always necessarily going to be constant. You need to have the ability to forecast. So obviously, in order to determine which customer will be able to bring you the most, you're supposed to forecast using unconstrained demand, and we will look at that a bit later. You have to you can use this in segmentable markets. So then you can put different customers in different markets in order to ensure that which type of segment is the most profitable for you. And then it's also depending on the cost structure. So obviously, every single firm has fixed costs and variable costs, and it depends on the cost structure as to where revenue management works in. Again, very important part, this first section, you have the specific problems of revenue management. It's very easy to forget, but the main three are length of stay. So obviously, when you are looking at which customer will bring you the most, you have to consider how long they stay, right? You have the minimum LOS restrictions, you have the maximum LOS restrictions that we will look at later on, but you have to look at, especially during high demand, how you're going to manage the arrivals of guests and things like that in order to ensure that you can maximize your revenue and therefore maximize your profit. You also have to consider the multiplier effect. Very often it is difficult to predict the ancillary revenues. If you are not a group and you are a transient guest, it is difficult to determine how much customers are going to spend in your hotel. So remember that ancillary revenue are other features that you have in your hotel, such as the F&B or the spa facilities, and these are all things to take into account. But again, if you're not in a group, it's difficult to determine how much money transient guests will be able to bring you. You also need to look at the booking lead time, which is another problem that there is. So booking lead time is looking at the time of booking, so at what time customers book in relation to their check-in date. The aim of revenue management is to increase profitability rather than to increase utilization. So again, revenue management looks at the whole managing of revenue, and therefore you're doing that in order to increase and gain the most profits that you can, because that's the whole purpose of a business, right? So we can look at revenue management as we can take it as further and look at total profit management, because again, the whole purpose of revenue management is we're trying to gain the most revenue we can in order to generate the most profit. Remember that revenue managers allocate inventory among price levels or market segments in order to maximize the total expected revenue or profits. So again, it's all looking at maximizing the total expected revenue and profits, and you're looking at allocating the inventory using the market segments. And what that means is that you're trying to allocate the correct customer segment. You're trying to organize it in relation to your inventory in order to ensure that you have the most revenue, especially during uncertain levels of demand. And here we see on the right a small little table that looks at the differences between what's normally the managerial side of the revenue management. So you look at revenue maximization is what revenue management is supposed to be, or what it originally was. And now you're looking at more profit optimization, customer-centric approach, because you have to understand your customers, right, in order to know what they want to better meet their needs. And you also have to look at the long-term strategies, because obviously you're not looking at the short term, you're looking at trying to create the most profitability in the long run. And you have to also look at channel management, and you have to look at the big data. So how can you use big data to better optimize and to better forecast in the future? Now we're going to move on to chapter 2. I'm just going to check if there are any questions. Yes, Sebastian, I see that you had your hand up. Do you have any questions or something to add, or no?
Hi, hey Alex. I was just curious if you could record the session or not.
I believe the session is being recorded by Jordan. Sorry, I forgot his name.
Okay, thank you.
It's just that on the Teams thing, it's a bit complicated because we as students are not allowed to record it. So I can't, if you look at my screen, I'm unable to click on the start recording. So we have managed that in order to let you guys rewatch this in the future. So we're going to move on to chapter 2. I hope I'm not going too fast. So chapter 2, we have the KPIs, so the key performance indicators, and we have looked at that in the previous semesters. But just as a little recap, the main KPIs that we have are things like average daily rate, the occupancy percentage, the RevPAR. You have the TRevPAR, which is the total room revenue per available room. You have the revenue per available customer, the revenue per occupied room. So there's a lot of different key performance indicators we can look at to determine what we're doing, whether it's working or whether it's not working. We also have more external performance indicators, such as market penetration index, which is the occupancy index on the STR report, if you guys remember. We also have the average rate index, which is the ADR index, and we have the revenue generator index, which is the RevPAR index. So quick little recap. So RevPAR, known as revenue per available room, there are two ways to calculate it. You can either multiply ADR times the occupancy percentage, or you can take the total room revenue and divide it by the total rooms available. So our total rooms available for sale. That is not just occupied rooms. I would just like to highlight that. How many rooms you have available for sale. So things that are, for example, out of order doesn't count because you can't sell that room, right? Now we have TRevPAR, or total revenue per available room. So it looks at all the revenue factors generated by a hotel and provides insight on the overall performance. So instead of taking just room revenue, you take the total revenue of the hotel and you divide by the total rooms available for sale. Next, we have revenue per available customer. So that is again looking at how much revenue each customer brings, and it's especially useful when comparing two groups of guests. So you can look at looking at customer equity, and you can look at which guest brings you more. So it can help you with looking at which guest has is more profitable in the sense of which one tends to spend more. We also have revenue per occupied room. So in order to do that, it's the total revenue divided by total occupied rooms. So again, different to the rooms available. And that is looking at the average room revenue generated by each occupied guest during a specific period. So if you would like to know how much, if you want to kind of narrow it down and not have the hotel in total, but looking at only the occupied rooms, this would be an ideal way to do it. We then have net revenue per available room, or NRevPAR, which is calculated by taking the net room revenue divided by the available rooms. I would just like to highlight that net rooms revenue is calculated by taking the rooms revenue, subtracting the distribution costs, the travel agent commissions, and the transaction fees, to look at how much revenue you're making net per room. Because obviously, if you're booking a room through an OTA or a travel agent, in other words, the hotel has to pay a certain commission. So you need to remove that to look at exactly how much revenue is being brought in terms of the rooms. So again, it's very, very similar to RevPAR. Net revenue per available room, except that, again, it just takes the net revenues, hence why it's a bit more accurate because it accounts for other costs. So you can look at the net revenue, so you can look at whether your distribution costs or your TA commissions are very, very high. Next, we have the gross operating profit per available room. So this is looking at the average gross operating profit generated by each available guest during a specific time. So here, to calculate it, you take the gross operation profit and you divide it by the total rooms available for sale. So very similar to RevPAR, the total rooms available, not the total rooms occupied. the gross operating profit. To calculate it, you take the total revenue and you subtract management controllable expenses. The trend is nowadays in the market, as a side note, the trend is now to look more at RevPAR and GoPAR because they tend to look at the industry or the hotel as a whole. But I would just like to highlight again that RevPAR and GoPAR, or gross operating profit per available room, they are not the same thing. Because essentially when you look at RevPAR, you can assume that a higher RevPAR means a better performance because you're making more room revenue, but gross operating profit could be decreasing. So gross operating profit, because it looks at costs, it gives you a better insight as to how well the hotel is performing. Next, in terms of KPIs, we also have efficiencies. So we have, for example, 4 main efficiencies that we discuss in class. So we have rate efficiencies, which is an indication of ADR achieved against a benchmark. So you have, for example, you can look at it against, for example, best available rate, right? That could be your benchmark, and you're looking at how efficient your rate is. So this could either be measured against specific segments or aggregate segments, depending on the needs of the business. So again, it depends on how the business is functioning. Next, we have room type efficiency, which is the indication of a specific room type ADR versus either total room ADR or optimal benchmark. And this is set by the revenue team. So you're looking at maybe which room type is bringing you the most, or which room type is most efficient, or which room type has the highest ADR. So this is a good way to compare which one is bringing the most revenue. Then we have the sellout efficiency, which looks at how many times the hotel was sold out in periods over 95%. So you're looking at how many times do you have total full occupancy, and then this can help you determine things like the unconstrained demand and such. And it indicates if the business is managed correctly at high demand periods. So it looks at things like overbookings, it looks at no-shows. So the more times you sell out, you can argue that the more times you're being successful because you're selling all your rooms and everything like that, and the more overbookings you have, however, that's a negative sign. So you can also monitor overbookings, because if you don't have a room for a guest, you kind of have to turn them away and you have to relocate them, and that comes at a cost. Finally, we have the channel efficiency, which is looking at the relation between the rates achieved from one distribution channel versus the overall average rate. This can be measured by looking at one distribution channel versus the overall distribution rates, so an aggregate, or against a broader spectrum. So again, you can look at the whole thing, or channel to channel, to look at the how efficient your rates are achieved are. Next, we have indices. Or index is the singular. So as I explained previously, the indices are more at looking at the external comparison. So ideally, or essentially, KPIs such as RevPAR look at more in the internal operations of the business or of the hotel. Indices provide you or permit you to compare with the external market. So this would be exactly what was on the STR report, right? So you can look at how well you are doing either against the whole market or a specific competitive set. So we have the market penetration index, which is looking at how your occupancy compares to the market, or to a certain amount of competitors, if you like. And this is achieved by looking at taking your hotel occupancy and dividing it by the market. So if your market penetration index is above 1, you see that your hotel occupancy on average is greater than that of the market. If you see that it is below 1, that means the market occupancy average is greater than yours. The same is said for average rate index and revenue generation index. So again, that looks at comparing your hotel stats to the market. And again, you can use these to determine what changes to be made. Either you want to have more occupancy, either you want to change the ADR in order to affect the RevPAR, because as we've already mentioned before, occupancy times ADR is equal to RevPAR. So again, if you're larger than 1, that means you're outperforming the market. Now we're going to move on to chapter 3. I hope that it's clear for everyone. Does anyone have any questions? Am I going too fast? Please let me. Which looks at pricing strategies. So we have three main pricing strategies that are used in general, which are cost-based, competition-based, and demand-based. So cost-based methods look at the cost-plus method. They look at break-even analysis. They look at marginal pricing. But in revenue management, we don't actually use this because it's not very, it's not beneficial to us in any way. We're going to look more at the competition-based and the demand-based. So competition-based is when you look at competitors, you look at market averages, you use things like indices, and you try to create a dominant price in the market. And demand-based methods, you look at the perceived value, you look at the customer needs, and you try to create. You look at value pricing. So here you try to function your prices in relation to demand. And on the right, we have a little table that gives you the main strengths and weaknesses. So you'll see that for customer value-based pricing, that has the most strengths. Hence why it is mainly used the most, because it looks at the customer. It looks at creating customer value, and that's what you're trying to do in order to motivate more customers to come to your hotel. Next, we're going to look at the main pricing strategies. So we have the list is longer than this, but these are the main that we have discussed in class. So you have market penetration, and this is where you try to set a lower price than the competitors to try to enter the market. Very often it is used by hotels to gain a quick amount of market share, and then later on they tend to increase the prices once people start coming in. You have equal pricing strategy, which looks at you setting an equal price to the competition, and this is especially a case where you have to look at creating more value, because if the price is the same and the quality, if you're both 3-star hotels, how can I get more customers? I have to look at creating more value. You have surrounding, and this is where you look at building a reputation. So here you look at a price above and under, so you kind of surround the market to try to be in both ends of the spectrum. And then you have price skimming, which is where you start really, really high, and then later on you come down. And skimming kind of has a sense of exclusivity behind it, because a lot of people believe that the more expensive something is, the better it tends to be. Not always true, but this is the way price skimming works. You also have an auction format, which is kind of, we don't really discuss that much in revenue management, but it's the opaque method, which is where people, go on an auction, and whoever has the highest bid gets the hotel room. But that is not necessarily the most efficient strategy, because very often you don't look at the price that is the best for you. Next, we look at price match guarantee. Now, I'm sure a lot of us have heard about this before, which is where a hotel promises to reimburse you if their customers find a lower price elsewhere. So research found that consumers perceive stores that offer price matching guarantees to have lower prices, because, again, if you find a lower offer somewhere else, you get reimbursed. So it's a very, very useful method, because it helps eliminate the incentive for underpricing, because very often I can price lower than you to attract more customers. So if you have price match guarantee, you don't get to have a lower price because you get reimbursed regardless. It's also, again, to remove the underpricing. It's an anti-competitive tactic against competition, because it's preventing them to steal the market share by having really, really low prices. And it leads later on, guaranteed price matching. If agreed with other hotels, you can end up having higher prices, because if there's an agreement with everybody, you can charge slightly higher, so that brings more revenue as well. So in a highly differentiated market, you are price makers, because when your value proposition is differentiated, when you look at customer value, you tend to create the price, because you stand out, right? So if everyone, if a hotel looks at meeting your needs and creating value, they stand in front. They have a foot in front of everyone, because they have an advantage, and therefore here's where you say customer value leader is a price maker. Now we're going to move on customer value-based pricing. So this looks at reflecting the value of the product or service from the consumer's perspective. So this is very, very essential, because you're looking at creating additional customer value, right? And it's all about their perspective. You're putting yourself in their shoes. So to optimize pricing, companies need to consider how to best segment the market, so that prices reflect the differences in value perceived by different types of consumers. So again, you're looking at you're taking the lens of the customer and seeing how you can give them the perception that you're giving them more value. So effective revenue managers understand that all rational buyers do seek to gain an increase in value. So again, it's all about creating value, about standing out, about meeting their needs more. And in order to do this, you need to have a comprehensive understanding of the customer and what they want, right? You can't offer value to a customer if you don't know what they want. So the perceived value for a customer is found by the outcome divided by the cost. So things like the outcome could be the quality, the service, the image, and divided by the cost would be the cost, whether it's price, whether it's time, whether it's energy. And yes. All right. Now, moving on, we have biases that a lot of revenue management managers could use in order to help with this perception of value. So a cognitive bias is a type of bias that affects all customer decisions, and a type of cognitive bias would be the decoy effect. So the decoy effect is a cognitive bias that you can use in pricing. And to illustrate this, say for example, you go to a fast food restaurant, or you go to any restaurant really, and you have a small Coke that costs $3, and you have a large Coke that costs $8, right? So you have $3 or $8. Some people.
Alex, I think you got muted.
Sorry. How long was I muted for? What did I
1 second, literally. Maybe go back 5 seconds.
Okay, thank you. So what was the last thing that you guys heard, by the way? Was I on biases already?
Yeah, decoy effect.
Okay, awesome. So the decoy effect, best way I can illustrate this is that, say, for example, you go to the cinema and you have 2 sizes of popcorn. So small size costs $4 and the large size costs $8. So you have $4 or $8. In a case like this, what a revenue manager could do is, not many people are buying $8 because they find it too expensive. So what you could do is, say, for example, I change the large to a medium, so the $8 becomes a medium, and I introduce an even bigger size at $12. Now, the decoy effect would suggest that customers now don't think that the $8 is as expensive anymore. So you see the example here that I have on the presentation. As another example to illustrate it again is, say for example, you have one item at $5 and the other at $10. Comparing $10 to $5, you think that $10 is way too expensive. It's not worth it. So a revenue manager could introduce either a larger size at 15, or they can introduce a size between 5 and 10. But in this case, say, presume, like at Starbucks, they introduce a larger size at a higher price. All of a sudden, customers won't compare $10 to $5. They're more likely to deem the $15 more expensive. So you're going to have more customers being leaning to spending the $10 that you want them to spend, because they perceive that they're getting a better deal. Right? Because they're thinking, I get a bigger size at a better price. $15 is too much. You see this very, very often in real life cinemas or in Starbucks, where the price difference between, say, for example, a small or a medium in Starbucks is larger than the price difference between a medium and a large. And people go for large because they think they're getting a better deal, because they're getting X more for this amount. The quantity per gram, say for instance, is smaller. So again, this decoy effect would be a way for you to really to motivate customers to maybe purchase a different item. Here we have a little graph that looks at the customer perception. So if you have very high quality but a very low price, it's underpriced for you. So you're trying to look at, ideally, getting between the average cost benefit, the cheap goods, or the premium offering. So you're looking along that line where you can have more or less an equal balance between quality and price, because you don't want to make the customer feel like they're being ripped off, but you also don't want to lose money. So you're looking at getting an average cost benefit because you're wanting to make money but also make the guests happy. So we have other different methods of pricing as well. So you have single rate pricing. It's when you're charging the same price to all buyers of all segments. So, regardless of who you are, you have the same price, full stop, end of story. You have differential pricing, which is essentially looking at when a seller charges different prices to different buyers for the same or slightly different products. To successfully differentiate the price to the customer, each price must be explainable and justifiable. So you must, highlight different items or different features that make it look like they're not being ripped off. So again, differential pricing is more useful because here you have a better understanding of your customers. You're not just charging the same price to anyone, but say, for example, for a more profitable guest or a guest with a higher willingness to pay, you can charge slightly more. If for a very small difference, say for example, you look at Apple, right? If you take the difference in memory between one iPhone and another, it's just a difference in memory, but the price difference is very large. And they justify that price difference by saying, you get 200 gigabytes as opposed to 100, right? So it's a way for people to say, right, okay, I get more and I'm paying X amount, so I'm being charged a different amount, even though regardless of how much data you have, the phone is more or less exactly the same. So differential pricing is also a lot better in the sense because you can gain extra revenue. If you charge a premium price, you can attract buyers that have a higher willingness to pay, so get more revenue. You can charge your normal price or your standard price and get revenue from the normal guest. And you can also have discounted prices for guests that have a lower willingness to pay, but you can still attract them. So this is why it's a lot more beneficial to look at differential pricing. Dynamic pricing is a method that firms use to adjust price in relation to levels of demand. So the higher the demand, the more you charge. The lower the demand, in order to stimulate demand, you charge a lower price. So that's looking at the function of demand and trying to make the most of, especially when you're in peak times, to make the most money you can. The main advantages associated with that is that you can increase revenue. It's plain and simple. You can charge more when you have a higher demand. You can charge less when you need to stimulate demand. When demand is low, by charging less, you end up creating more demand, right? So you can get so that enables a wider range of services. Again, dynamic pricing stimulates demand because if, for example, you want to go to a 5-star hotel and the price is too high for you, in a time where demand is low, they tend to have lower prices. So you are more inclined to go there because you can say, right, I can get a 5-star hotel experience for a much lower price. And for the hotel, they're actually selling a room because selling a room at an amount is better than selling a room for an amount that covers the variable cost is better than just keeping it empty, right? Because if you keep it empty, it's a lost opportunity, and having some form of revenue is better than having none, especially if you can cover the variable cost. The main disadvantages of that is that consumers who tend to pay a higher price may feel ripped off. So, if I pay $100 for a room and you pay $80, I might feel like, especially when there's no price match guarantee, I can feel that, I'm paying more for the same thing. You're paying less, so you're getting a better deal, sort of thing. Because if a company keeps changing prices, customers may not be able to trust them because they keep changing. They change their minds all the time, so it may be hard to be more loyal to them. It helps customers find a way around dynamic pricing because if the price is very, very high, you might have a customer that either doesn't go to you at all, or they might try to find a loophole around it. Another disadvantage of dynamic pricing is that, again, it's very costly. You have to understand demand. You have to conduct research to look at levels of demand because you can't, change prices without knowing the fluctuations in demand, right? So that's very, very costly. We have rate fences, which we looked at. We looked at last semester in rooms division management. Was there a question? Yep.
Yeah, sorry to disturb you. There are some questions on the chat.
Okay. Awesome. Well, it's just that you don't get the notification when you're doing it. So, how do I find the outcome as a manager? Well, the outcome comes from the guest, right? Because it's the guest that evaluates things like the quality and the service level that they get. So that could be done in things like reviews that you have at the end of the stay, right? The guest looks at how they felt the quality was, what they feel the image is, and how safe they was, how their experience was in terms of quality and things like that. Example of cognitive bias. So cognitive bias is more broad because it's generally it essentially is a bias that you have, a subconscious thought that you have when I'm losing my train of thought here. So again, cognitive bias is any sort of bias that you have in relation to your thoughts, right? A bias is very broad. A type of cognitive bias would be the decoy effect. I hope that makes sense. There's various different types of cognitive bias. A cognitive bias is essentially, something that you're naturally inclined to. An example of a cognitive bias is you favor one country or one sports team over another because you support it. You know what I mean? That could be an example of a cognitive bias. The decoy is the item that pushes you to buy the item. So the decoy, in the decoy effect, would be the item that you introduce. So say, for example, I have $4 and $8 again. The decoy would be the one that I introduce in order to motivate people to change their behavior. I hope that makes sense. Sebastian says it makes you it makes you as a customer buy a product that you usually wouldn't because of exactly. So that's right. So with dynamic pricing, right? Say for example, again, you as a student, some of us may not have the funds to go to a 5-star hotel. So when a company uses dynamic pricing and they have lower prices during, to stimulate during low demand, you might think, okay, I normally can't afford a 5-star hotel. Now I can. It's in my budget. So you get the idea that you're getting a better deal, right? You're given the chance to experience something you wouldn't normally experience. And by doing that, it could be more beneficial in the long run, because if your breath was taken away completely and you go to a hotel and you're like, I was completely wowed, in the long run, you could end up revisiting them again, right? Because again, you get the experience. Some people may not really understand that 5-star hotel is worth a big price. A lot of people think it's overpriced all the time. So if you go there, you might better understand why they charge such a high price. So you can be like, okay, I like this. I really like this experience. I want to return there again. So that was very, very well put there, Sebastian. Very well paraphrased. All right, so rate fences. So essentially, like we learned in rooms division management last semester, a rate fence is a specific requirement that describes who is and who is not eligible for a specific offer. So an example of a rate fence could be Smurf, right? If you're an elderly, you are subject to a discount. If you are a government member, you are subject to a discount. So these are examples of requirements, things you must meet in order to be eligible for it. They are also known as hurdles or barriers. However, they must be legal and must be rational. You cannot put a rate fence based on ethnicity, for example. That's not legal. You can't discriminate people. But you can say, okay, if you're an elder or you have a certain job or you were in affiliation with a corporate, with a company, and you get a lower rate because of that, that is rational because, again, you have an agreement or someone works for the government, things like that. So again, they are policies that a company uses to determine who gets what price, and can be used to help differentiate one transaction from another. They're used to prevent customers with a higher willingness to pay to have a discount. So say, for example, you want to have people spend the most they can, right? So if you want something that's non-guaranteed, for example, or, you have reimbursement or, you have more benefits, you tend to pay more. A well-designed rate fence allows customers, and this is where it gets very, very important, it allows customers to self-segment based on their willingness to pay. So depending on how much you want to pay, you would get maybe a 50% refundable or a non-refundable or a non-guaranteed where you can cancel without any payments, right? Non-guaranteed, you tend to pay more. So if you want to pay, you want to have the ability to cancel at the last minute, you pay more. If you want to not cancel, you pay less. So it lets customers put themselves based on how much they're willing to spend. We also have, so here we have main examples of two categories of rate fences. We have physical and non-physical. So physical, we look at things like the basic products, so the class, the size of the room, the furnishing, the table location in a restaurant, for example. You can look at amenities, which is the second example of physical fences, which looks at, do you get a valet? Do you get a golf cart? Do you have a butler? Things like that. So, extras that you have. Oh, butler would be a service level, sorry. You look at amenities, things like, do you have a free golf cart at a golf course? Or do you have valet parking? Or do you have a free hotel pickup? And last, you can look at service level. So you look at, are you on a priority waiting list? Do you have a better F&B selection? Do you have, better service hotlines? Do you have a personal butler? Things like that would be the third example of a service level product fence. So these are all things, if you want a butler, you would pay more. If you don't want one, you wouldn't pay for it. Non-physical fences include things like time of booking. So generally, the earlier you book, the lower the price. That's what, kind of what we tend to see. You look at the location of the booking, you look at the flexibility so this would be an example of the transaction characteristics. You look at the flexibility of the reservation. Can you cancel? Can you not cancel? Do you have to pay a guarantee or a deposit? Do you not? Do you have to pay for cancellation? Things like that. You have consumption characteristics. So, time and duration of use. So an example of a consumption characteristic would be, for example, do you get an early bird in a restaurant, right? Sometimes restaurants give a discount if you come at 6 p.m. as opposed to the regular 7 p.m. And then you have buyer characteristics, which looks at things like and they want valet parking and they want a bigger room. That all generates, higher rates, that generates more revenue. So again, it generates more revenue. You are able to segment the market, which will help you to meet customer needs more successfully to gain more revenue. And it also provides a positive image to the business because you offer more options to the guests. They may feel, there's more to choose from. The company is, is allocating things to my liking. If they have a perfect package that you like at a good enough price, it makes customers like you more and makes them more comfortable and gives you a more positive image. Rate fences, very, very, very often companies look at discounting, and that's not always the best thing to do. Because again, discounting, if you discount too much, you end up not making enough money or you don't make money at all, and that's a big issue. Sometimes it is unfair. Sometimes customers may feel, discriminated in the sense of they might feel they're paying significantly more for not enough in return. It is also very difficult to conduct because a lot of research is to be done to segment correctly, and very, very often the wrong segmentation criteria leads to a lot of issues. You're not segmenting correctly, you can't meet customer needs the right way, and then it ends up being detrimental. So essentially, the revenue management system helps to make decisions such as how rooms are allocated to rate levels, distribution channels, and how many rooms to overbook based on predicted demand and probability. Now we're going to move to chapter 4. I will just check if there are any questions. Price grant? Price guarant or price? Are you meaning price guarant or price grant? So from what I know, if it's a price guarant, it would be an example of a rate fence. Yes, I believe it would be an example of a rate fence, but that's not something that we really discuss at least in my course. We haven't really looked at that yet. We're looking at more how you can change the physical aspects and the non-tangible aspects in order to create different options and different levels of offers to the guests. All right, so chapter 4. Demand forecasting. So things to know about forecasting. It's very rarely perfect. Especially, it's all based on an assumption or what you on past data. So you can never guarantee that what you predict is going to happen. It's better on aggregated data than for individual items, and forecasts tend to be more accurate for shorter rather than long-term periods. If you extrapolate for 3 years in advance, a lot more difficult to determine what your demand is going to be, as opposed to what your demand is going to be next week, right? Because next week, if you're a hotel, you're still in the COVID pandemic, you're not going to get a high demand. In 3 years, who knows? Is there still going to be COVID? Is there going to be another pandemic? Or is demand going to shoot through the roof? You don't know. So that's why it's more accurate in the short term than it is in the long term. We have three main methods. We have the more subjective methods, which you look at Delphi models and you look at expert opinions. So it's not really science-based. The more science-based stuff comes in the time series models and the causal models. So time series looks at moving averages, exponential smoothing. You look at historical data. You try to take into account random variation. And the thing with time series models is that you assume the future will follow the same patterns as in the past. So you're looking at things like, relating it to seasonality, right? You look at a hotel in the Alps during winter, you tend to have more demand. It's happened for the past 30 years, so you assume that it's going to happen again. The causal models or regression models will look at or highlights key factors. So it looks at leading indicators to predict the future. So you look at cause and effect relationships. So this is where we look at, a more looking at regression models. That's where we put more the statistics side to it. So three main ways of forecasting. You have demand forecasting, which is looking at selling guidelines to establish demand criteria for revenue forecasts. So this is more strategy and represents unconstrained demand. So here you look at, looking at facilitating the development of selling guides. You identify excess demand and things like that. You have occupancy forecasting, which is more operational orientated, and it tells operating departments how likely the busy is expected to be, or how busy the hotel is expected to be. So this looks at constrained demand, because if you're looking at occupancy, you can only go to 100% occupancy and accept a certain amount of guests, right? You can't accept more guests than rooms you have. So this is where occupancy forecasting will look at the constrained demand. And then you have revenue forecasting, which is more financially orientated. And here you inform the senior management of an ownership of the occupancy rates and revenue estimates for the next 3 months and beyond. So here you look at it helps facilitate purchasing requirements. It helps looking at individual market segments. It's produced monthly, and it estimates room nights, average rates, and revenues. And it, again, represents constrained demand. You cannot do revenue forecasting on unconstrained demand because you can't accept all the demand in the market. You can only accept those you can fit in your hotel. Next, we look at the definition of unconstrained demand. So unconstrained demand simply is the demand in the absence of restrictions. Essentially, it looks at the whole demand of the market. So assuming you had an infinite amount of rooms, this is the demand that you have. Unconstrained demand can be calculated by taking the constrained demand, adding the denials, and adding the regrets. So denials are looking at when you can't accept the booking for a room. So an example of a denial would be if your room is sold out, if it's CTA, if you can't meet the minimum length of stay. This would be an example where you cannot accept the request for a booking. An example of a regret is where a customer just plainly doesn't book. This could be due to maybe the room feature not available. So they go on your website, they say, okay, I want to book at this hotel, and they don't have a suite, so I'm not going to book. It could also be maybe you call the hotel, you ask for a rate, the rate is too high, the guest doesn't book. So that is another example of a regret. It is very important to base forecast demand initially on unconstrained. It will enable the organization to determine its pricing and inventory management strategy. So when you create the forecast, base it on unconstrained demand, so you have the whole market to take into account. Constrained demand is looking at the demand that is held back or confined by rules, restrictions, and or availability. So the clearest example of constrained demand is how many due to the amount of rooms that you have, right? So you can't accept a certain amount of people because you have only X amount of rooms. So that would be an example of constrained demand, how many people you can actually fit. Unconstrained demand is the demand that exists for a given perishable asset, both without reference to price levels and stay controls that the seller will ultimately select to contain it. So again, to calculate unconstrained demand, you have the little equation or the formula here. And yes, so moving on. The variations in demand. So you have very often variations in demand when it comes to, and it's important to note this down or to take this into account. You have things like the time of day. Is there the peak demand or Is there a lot of demand in the morning? Is it at midday? You have to consider the time of year. You have to consider the day of week in order to look at how unconstrained demand varies. We have demand generators, which demand generators are simply, events or entities or events that produce a significant increase in business. So, for example, a demand generator in Switzerland would be the Geneva Motor Show, right? It's an event that causes a lot of people to come in to the country, and it stimulates a massive amount of demand for hotels. A demand drain is the opposite. It's a circumstance that produces a significant decrease in bookings in business. So say, for example, this could be if Switzerland went through strike or had mass protests, it would motivate people to not come to Switzerland, and therefore business will decrease substantially. The booking curve, because I think we have to speed up a little bit. I've been blabbing on for too long. A booking curve is essentially a graphical representation or presentation that illustrates how reservations accumulate over time. So I think we've all seen in class the graph that looks at the success or how many more bookings we have. So leisure guests tend to book early. And so you see the booking curve tends to start very high, very, very early, and then business guests tend to book late. So the booking curve tends to, increase very, very rapidly. Pickup is essentially the average number of requests that you receive between today and the day of arrival. So say, for example, next week, right now, I have 15 bookings for my hotel next week. And next week, I end up having 45 guests in the room in my hotel. My pickup would be equivalent to 30 because I have gained 30 guests from a specific day until the day of arrival. That's how many, pickup, it's kind of in the name. Pickup is how many you attract and how many bookings you actually get. In the short run, it's very, very accurate. So when it's 3 or 4 days in advance, it's very, very accurate because you look at the demand and it's very, bookings. There's very, very few times you book the day you go there. You tend to book 3 or 4 days in advance, or maybe 2 days in advance. And it requires the building of a pickup matrix, which I think we've all done an Excel activity on it, which you need to calculate the pickup matrix upon the average booking curve. I would just like to highlight that in terms of vocab, reservation on hand or on the book reservations is the number of reservations that you have on a certain day. So on the book would be, for example, 15 reservations today would be 15 reservations on the book. All right, so we're now going to go on the demand control chart. So essentially, the demand control chart can help decide when to change rates based on expected demand. So again, rate control with demand control chart. You're looking at controlling the rates in function to demand. So you must calculate the forecast for each day and then look at the forecasted occupancy rate. Then you determine specific trigger points, and the trigger points are associated with room rates. And the trigger points, that's one of the drawbacks. The trigger points are not associated with the trigger points are difficult to develop, so it's not easy to create them, which is one of the drawbacks. Then you select trigger points and associate them with room rates. So, for example, when you reach a certain amount of occupancy, you would have to change rates. Like, say, for example, if I reach 65% occupancy, that is a trigger for me to increase rates. Then you can make recommendations. Whether you close certain rates, you keep them open, and eventually you can set the best available rate, which is known as the BAR. Quick bit of vocab: minimum length of stay is the minimum amount of nights you need to stay in order to make a booking. So this is especially useful during high demand peaks or during high demand. Say, for example, if you want to go to a hotel in the Geneva Motor Show, they're going to say you must stay a minimum of 4 nights to have a booking. So otherwise, if you don't have minimum 4 nights, we won't accept you. So that's an example of min LOS. Maximum LOS is it imposes strict limits on how long you can stay. So say, for example, it's essentially before high demand, say, for example, the weekend before or the couple of days before the Geneva Motor Show, you're not going to ask a guest to spend a week because the Geneva Motor Show, with the increase in demand, you want to charge a higher rate. So this is where you would impose on a max LOS to say, okay, you can stay 2 nights with us, but then once the demand picks up, we want to charge a higher rate. Close to arrival, CTA is specifying that there's no new reservations to be taken for a specific arrival date. So that's, for example, at a rate segment of $150, it's too low. So you would put CTA in which no one in that rate segment is able to make a booking. Finally, to looking at forecasting error management, you have bias and precision. So we're going back on the idea of bias again, and bias is a problem of direction. So you're looking at downward bias and upward bias. So downward bias is where you're looking at you forecast too low, and upward bias you forecast too high. So either you're too optimistic or too pessimistic, and that's an example of bias because it's what you think, and therefore it affects what you do. Bias refers to a tendency of a forecast to be predominantly toward one side of the truth. So you're not looking at objectively; you're kind of having your own twist on it, or you're putting a bit of your own perception of your own feeling into the mix. Precision is an idea of magnitude. So precision is how close, it looks at the distance between the forecasts and the result of using a particular forecasting technique. So, and the actual values. So if you are precise, that means that your forecasts are very close to what really happened. If you are not precise, that means your forecasts were completely through the roof. It was either way too high or way too low, and this obviously is, again, a question of magnitude. It's the difference between two forecasts. Finally, we're looking at the main equations. So you have MAD, MSE, and MAPE. So MAD is looking at how large the deviations are on average. We have the formulas right here in the corner. MSE looks at taking the square value. However, what must be considered about that is that the MSE, it's more sensitive to large errors. So if you have a massive error, your MSE tends to be much, much, much higher. And it looks at the difference between estimated values and the actual value. The most important one, or probably the most relevant one, would be the MAPE. Because the MAPE looks at creating a percentage. And when you have a percentage, it becomes very easy. It becomes substantially easier to compare between hotels of different sizes, right? So if I have 10% of occupancy and you have 10% of occupancy, the proportion is the same. And comparing proportions is a lot easier. And again, you take the absolute value so that you don't have any negatives. Right, final chapter. I'm just going to check if I have any questions. There are no questions, so that is good. I presume everything is clear, and my computer is about to die, so that's great. So the final chapter is group request management. So example of groups would be social groups, military groups, educational groups. So that would be what SMRF is. Non-yieldable, when a price or when a deal is non-yieldable, that means you cannot change the price after they've been negotiated. So, in other words, this is specifically useful for corporate because, say, for example, you create a deal of $150 per room per night, and all of a sudden, the week of your arrival, there's a massive increase in demand. A hotel cannot change your rate because it's non-yieldable. So again, rates that non-yieldable are rates that cannot change as the demand changes. So if demand increases, the rates cannot increase. A room block is essentially the portion of hotels, the portion of a hotel's inventory, so how many rooms a hotel has, that is set aside for a particular period of time for a client. So for example, a company calls me and wants 50 rooms. I would block 50 rooms for that company, right? It's just putting it aside so that these 50 rooms are not touched. They're not used in any way. They are reserved for a group, and they're normally under a firm agreement and is for a set period of time. Attrition clause is what happens when a group does not live up to their booking. So we saw this in RDM last semester as well. So very often on a contract, you have 90 days before arrival, you can cancel 15% of your rooms. 30 days before arrival, you can cancel 10%, and 1 month before your arrival, or 2 weeks before your arrival, you can only cancel 1% of your group. The attrition clause is there to protect the business, because if you have 50 rooms and the day before you decide to cancel 30 of them, that's 30 rooms worth for a hotel, then they've lost business, right? Because whatever rooms you block, you cannot give to another guest. So the attrition clause is if a group decides to cancel most of their bookings and go outside of their agreement, they have to pay the compensation, the equivalent of the room, because you can't just forcefully make the hotel miss out on a lot of business. Booking outside the block would be when attendees go to other internet sources to secure the best room rate, or they go to a hotel near the meeting or the convention. So this would be another example. Going back to the Geneva Auto Show, is you can say, for example, on one OTA it's more expensive, so you go elsewhere. You find something else, and near the same location or near the Geneva Auto Show, you find another hotel at a better price that's more convenient for you. Group wash is essentially looking at the difference between contracted and blocked rooms for a group. It's essentially the number of rooms that the hotel believes the group will not use. So when you group wash, say for example, you have 50 rooms and I believe you're only going to use 40, I will wash 10 of your rooms because I think you're not going to use them. So that's the main vocab in terms of internal approaches regarding group management. For forecasting methods, you've got four main ways to do it. You've got the past utilization of the group, which is looking at historical records, looking at other hotels, and you're calculating the utilization rate, which is the actual arrivals divided by the tentative group booking block. So you're looking at how much of the rooms that were originally booked are being used. So you're looking at how much the group uses. You can look at booking pace, which is similar to transient forecasting. So you track group reservations, you build a percentage of the booking curve, and you use the percentage booking curve to forecast. So again, this is where you're looking at how fast people are booking. You have the sales estimate method, which is where sales managers have good info on the booking behavior, and they have a contract with the meeting planner of a group, and they have and they intend to create an estimate on how, and they're asked to create three different types of estimates. So they're asked to create an optimistic estimate, a most likely estimate, and a pessimistic estimate. So this is depending on how much rooms you believe the group is going to use. And the equation is you take the optimistic estimate, you add with 4 times the most likely, you add the pessimistic, and you divide it all by 6 to get to get what you believe is the right estimate of how many rooms the group is going to use. And later on, and the final one is the combination forecast, where you have a weighted average of all three. So say if you believe the sales estimate method is the most accurate, you would put a higher weighted average for the sales estimate. You would put a higher weighted average you put a lower weighted average for things like booking pace if you believe it's not really accurate, and so on and so forth until you can get the ideal number. So again, weights may vary. For the combination forecast, the weight of each method may vary depending on expertise of staff and the way the hotel functions. Now we look at displacement model, and it's essentially looking at how many customers or guests you have to turn away in order to accept a group. In other words, if you have 100 rooms and you have 80 rooms and you predicted 80 room occupancy, and all of a sudden a group calls you and says, we want 40 rooms. That means you have to displace 20 transient guests. You have to turn away 20 transient guests in order to accept the group. To do this, you must look at the different costs and revenues associated with the groups, and you have to try to look at, and this is where we look at the formula at the bottom, so it looks at the minimum rate you have to charge, but you have to look at, is the group that you're accepting bringing more than the guests you're turning away? So here for the group, you look at non-rooms contribution in order to look at the room rate, and then for the guests, you look at their room rate. So the money that you could, the potential money you can make, how much you're losing. In order to do this, you need to have a good forecast of the transient demand. You must have the expected size of the group. You must know the transient rates well. You must have them settled and correctly put. And you must look at the ancillary revenues, so non-rooms revenue. So the displacement model formula is you take the displaced contribution, you subtract the ancillary contribution, right? So the displaced contribution is the room rates that you are losing from the guests. The ancillary contribution is that of the group, right? You divide that by the total nights per group, or the total room nights. So say, for example, you have 10 rooms for 3 nights. The bottom number here would be 10 times 3, right? How many nights the whole group is how many room nights the group is taking, and you add the variable cost per room. And this will give you what is known as the minimum room rate, which is essentially the minimum rate you have to charge to the group in order to break even, right? So the displaced contribution, the way you do it is you take the amount of transient rooms displaced and you multiply by the profit per room in terms of transient guests. So to do that, you take the total transient revenue and you remove the variable cost. So you have transient rooms displaced multiplied by the contribution, and the non-room contribution, in the group's perspective, you take the total ancillary revenues and you subtract the total variable cost for ancillary services. So you look at really the net amount, and by doing that, by putting it into the equation, if you see that your ancillary contribution is larger, meaning that your F&B, the amount of revenue from F&B the group brings is greater than the displaced contribution, you can go with the group straight away. But by using this equation, it tells you, is the group bringing more than the displacement or than the guests I'm turning away? And this is useful to know whether you will accept a group or not. That is the end of the